In the 1950s, while the world believed the Soviet Union controlled its skies with iron discipline, American engineers and intelligence planners quietly proved something no one else dared to imagine. Without firing a single shot, the United States sent an aircraft straight through the heart of Soviet airspace, and nothing could stop it. No interceptors, no anti-aircraft guns, no warnings. For the men defending those skies, it was the moment they realized American technology had leaped far beyond anything they were prepared to face. For years, Soviet air defense units had been trained to respond instantly to any foreign aircraft. Fighters were launched within minutes, radar stations tracked targets with confidence, and commanders believed no intruder could survive long above their territory. This belief was deeply ingrained. The sky, after all, was supposed to be their domain. Yet suddenly, radar operators began reporting something that made no sense. A lone aircraft flying calmly at an altitude no Soviet fighter could reach, moving slowly, deliberately, as if it knew it was untouchable. At first, confusion spread through command posts and radar rooms. Pilots were ordered into the air, climbing higher and higher until their engines strained and the air thinned dangerously. But when they reached their maximum altitude, there was nothing to see. The radar still showed the intruder clearly, but the pilots stared into empty blue sky. Some officers accused radar crews of incompetence, others suspected equipment failure, yet the mysterious aircraft returned again and again, always beyond reach, always watching. For the soldiers and technicians responsible for defending Soviet airspace, the psychological impact was severe. They were not facing an enemy in combat, but something far worse, an enemy that ignored them completely. Every flight confirmed an unbearable truth. If American aircraft could operate freely at such heights, then missile sites, air bases, factories, and command centers were all exposed. The Soviet Union's carefully constructed image of total control was quietly unraveling in front of men who could do nothing but observe. As reports moved up the chain of command, concern turned into urgency. Soviet leaders understood that this was not merely a technical failure, but a strategic humiliation. Years of assumptions about radar coverage and interceptor capability had been shattered by a single American aircraft flying above 70,000 feet. The intruder did not challenge Soviet defenses, it rendered them irrelevant. For the first time since the end of World War II, Soviet planners were forced to confront the possibility that they were being watched constantly, powerless to respond. The reaction was swift and desperate. New radar systems were rushed into development, surface-to-air missiles were redesigned, and air defense doctrines were rewritten from the ground up. Entire military programs were launched not to defeat American bombers or fighters, but to stop one kind of aircraft that had already proven it could come and go at will. For years, every strange radar contact carried the same fear that the Americans were already overhead, unseen and unstoppable. When one of these high-flying intruders was finally brought down years later, the relief inside Soviet command was undeniable. Yet even that moment could not erase what had already happened. The damage was done. The realization had set in. For years, the United States had possessed the ability to see deep into the Soviet Union while remaining completely beyond reach. For the men who had once believed the sky was theirs, it was a lesson they would never forget. The Cold War is often remembered as a standoff of missiles and ideology, but for Soviet air defense crews in the 1950s, it was something far more personal. It was the quiet terror of watching American technology pass overhead, knowing that for the first time, the advantage in the sky belonged entirely to someone else.
By the late 1950s, the question inside Soviet command was no longer if American aircraft were penetrating their airspace, it was how often. Every unexplained radar contact carried a silent accusation. Somewhere above, unseen and unreachable, the Americans might already be watching. This uncertainty became a constant presence, an invisible pressure that settled over air defense units across the Soviet Union. Radar operators learned to dread certain signals. A slow-moving return at an impossible altitude was no longer surprising. It was expected. What terrified them was not the appearance of the aircraft, but its calm indifference. It did not maneuver aggressively. It did not evade. It behaved as if Soviet defenses simply did not exist. For men trained to protect the state at all costs, this quiet dismissal was unbearable. Pilots continued to be sent into the sky, even as confidence faded. Each mission followed the same pattern. Aircraft climbed beyond safe limits, engines screaming in protest, pilots straining against the edge of human endurance. Yet the outcome never changed. The intruder remained above them, unreachable. Some pilots returned shaken, humiliated by a fight they were never allowed to have. Others returned angry, demanding better aircraft, higher ceilings, stronger engines. But the truth was unavoidable. Technology had already decided the outcome. Inside Soviet research institutes, the mood turned grim. Engineers pored over equations, altitude charts, and radar data late into the night. Every calculation confirmed the same conclusion. Existing systems were obsolete. The Americans had not merely improved reconnaissance, they had redefined it. The Soviet Union was reacting to a future that had arrived without warning. This realization forced a dramatic shift in Soviet military thinking. Air defense was no longer just about stopping bombers or fighters, it was about defeating altitude itself. Missiles became the focus. Radar coverage expanded. Entire regions were reorganized around the fear of what might already be overhead. The sky, once a source of pride, had become a source of anxiety. For Soviet leadership, the political implications were just as severe. Publicly, the state projected confidence and control. Privately, officials understood that secrecy was compromised. Strategic facilities, nuclear sites, industrial complexes, all could be photographed without resistance. The idea that American analysts might be calmly studying images of the Soviet interior was deeply unsettling. Power, after all, depended not just on weapons, but on what the enemy knew. Meanwhile, in the United States, these flights reshaped intelligence itself. For the first time, policymakers could rely on direct visual confirmation rather than estimates and guesswork. The fog that had defined post-war intelligence began to lift. Decisions were made with clarity the Soviets could not match. This was not merely surveillance, it was strategic dominance through information. As the years passed, Soviet air defense forces lived in a state of constant readiness and constant doubt. Every radar anomaly was investigated, every high-altitude contact raised alarms. Yet even the most aggressive responses often ended the same way, with silence, frustration, and unanswered questions. The Americans had transformed the sky into a place of psychological warfare, where presence mattered more than firepower. When the balance finally shifted and Soviet defenses succeeded in bringing down one of these intruders, the moment was celebrated loudly. But beneath the triumph lay an uncomfortable truth. The victory came after years of vulnerability, years during which American aircraft had flown freely, collecting intelligence that could never be erased. One aircraft lost did not undo what had already been seen. In retrospect, this chapter of the Cold War reveals something essential. The conflict was not always loud, it was not always explosive. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was a single aircraft, high above the clouds, proving a point without confrontation. For Soviet air defense crews, the lesson was permanent. Control could be lost not through invasion, but through innovation. By the early 1960s, the world stood closer to nuclear confrontation than ever before. And yet long before missiles were aimed and speeches were made, the balance of power had already shifted silently in the sky. The Cold War was not only fought on the ground or at sea, it was fought above, where only one side could reach, and the other could only watch. In the end, the most unsettling weapon of the Cold War was not the bomb, it was knowledge. And for years, that knowledge belonged almost entirely to the United States.
By 1960, the silence above the Soviet Union had become unbearable. For years, American reconnaissance aircraft had crossed Soviet airspace with near impunity, exposing a vulnerability that no amount of ideology could conceal. Soviet leaders knew that every successful overflight was not just an intelligence loss, but a public humiliation waiting to happen. The pressure to restore control over the sky had reached its breaking point. Air defense units were placed on constant alert. Radar operators worked longer shifts, scanning the upper reaches of the atmosphere with a mixture of focus and dread. New missile batteries were deployed around key cities and strategic sites. For the first time, Soviet defenses possessed a weapon designed not to chase intruders, but to reach them. The sky was no longer assumed to be safe. It was a battlefield waiting for its first decisive moment. When the familiar radar signature appeared again, there was no confusion this time. Operators recognized the pattern instantly. The altitude, the speed, the calm trajectory. The intruder was back. Orders moved quickly through the chain of command. Missile crews prepared their systems. Engineers and officers watched their instruments with silent intensity. This time, the Soviet Union would not simply observe. As the aircraft continued its flight, missiles were launched. The moment was brief, almost anticlimactic. A single successful strike was all it took. For the first time, the untouchable had been touched. The news spread rapidly through Soviet command structures. Relief surged through air defense units. Years of frustration seemed to dissolve in an instant. The sky, at last, had fought back. Yet celebration quickly gave way to a more sobering reality. Even as the aircraft fell, Soviet leaders understood what could not be undone. One aircraft destroyed did not erase years of surveillance. It did not reclaim the secrets already photographed. It did not restore the illusion of absolute control. The Americans had already seen too much. The incident sent shockwaves far beyond Soviet borders. Internationally, it exposed a hidden dimension of the Cold War to the public. Privately, it confirmed what many strategists already knew. Technology had changed the nature of power. Dominance was no longer defined solely by armies or missiles, but who could see first, who could know more, and who could act with confidence while remaining beyond reach. Inside the Soviet Union, the aftermath was tense and introspective. Air defense doctrines were reevaluated, missile programs expanded, intelligence agencies tightened secrecy. But beneath all these changes lay an uncomfortable truth. The United States had forced the Soviet Union to react on American terms. Innovation had dictated strategy, not the other way around. For American planners, the lesson was equally clear. The era of uncontested overflights was ending, but the advantage gained would shape policy for decades. Intelligence gathered from the sky had reduced uncertainty, guided negotiations, and prevented miscalculations that could have led to catastrophic war. What began as a daring technological gamble had become a cornerstone of strategic stability. Looking back, this chapter of the Cold War reveals a quiet turning point. The confrontation was not defined by explosions or invasions, but by altitude and awareness. One side learned it could be watched, the other learned it could watch without being seen. Even when the balance shifted, the psychological impact remained. For Soviet air defense crews, the memory endured long after the alarms faded. They had lived through a period when the sky itself betrayed them, when technology stripped away certainty and replaced it with doubt. For the United States, it was a moment of confidence, proof that innovation could achieve what force alone could not.
The Cold War would continue for decades, filled with crises, confrontations, and close calls. But long before missiles faced each other across continents, the battle for the sky had already revealed something fundamental. Control was no longer guaranteed by power alone. It belonged to those who dared to think higher and reach further than anyone else.